Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the 25th module in the series Marketing Management, a VUCA perspective. We are discussing fundamentals and I am your friend and tour guide on this fabulous journey, Siddhi Prad Bhattacharya. We have discussed a lot about how market forces affect the way businesses can be run, what aspects of VUCA elements in fact implement themselves when it comes to the way marketers need to be aware of their surroundings and how best to tide their ways around these certain murky waters. We have to also now look at various models that start coming our way so that as marketers we are able to plan for all these scenarios better and are able to wade through these murky waters and come out on top and thereby steer the fortunes and destinies of our organizations towards a brighter future. This will be a three-part mini series on understanding these models that can help us establish a formatted approach in order to take on whatever market forces throw at us, and that will be taken through a variety of various models which we can look and explore in our day-to-day marketing activities. We start with the achievement of what we as thinkers in the marketing space want to achieve. We always dream that we'll gain something big out of the exercises, out of the campaigns, out of the entire activities that we get into, and no one better summarizes a dream than in the words of Honorable APJ Abdul Kalam ji, who was the missile man of India as well as a great thinker. He had a lot of philosophical understanding which was aimed at bettering the ways the youth of today would actually create a better destiny for the country at large. So, in his own words, a dream is not the thing that you see in your sleep, but it is that thing that won't let you sleep. So, it keeps you awake, it drives your passion, it is something that pushes you to attain the higher, the more attainable, the more unachievable, because if your dream is large enough, you can work your way up to ensuring that that dream becomes your destiny. So, with those very, very inspiring words, we step into the entire stories of models, marketing models that ensure that we measure the viability in the most efficient way possible. And we look at how industries also evolve and underscore the need for these marketing models, and that is where we will also take certain few caselets which we will use in our consideration set. We map corporate success through these models and we use them as a standardized approach, so that if we have established that this is the right way to do something, we repeat those particular successes and create efficiencies over time. In the first part of this entire conversation on understanding models to get the viability going in marketing, we will look at strategy and model approaches with one particular very fundamental model to start things off with, which will be the SWOT matrix. And before that, let's just understand why we need to do this. Strategy is where we all thinkers in marketing are basing our entire set of activities from. Strategy is our game plan. It is what makes us who we are. We are thinkers, we are people who try and foresee circumstances, situations, scenarios a long time before they actually come to pass. And that is precisely why we are the people who ensure that with strategy we know how you want to play with your entire team if you want to win. Our way of playing is through the strategy that we actually bring and manifest on the ground, and on the other hand, winning any game is at the center of all of our focus. So, marketing and winning at business capabilities is also the larger game at corporations and organizations that we keep playing. The thinking team is the marketing team. This is what we call defining the objective, because this what we have to achieve, the what is that part of the game which will define that once we've reached this, we have won that particular path to the correct success strategy that we wanted to implement. The term objective is quite clear for more organizations. Strategy is more fluid, it's more open to conjecture, open to interpretation. Some very aggressive ways are also brought into play when people play aggressive to win, but there are times where other people play defensive to minimize whatever losses they can cut and walk away with their head held high. And meanwhile, they want to gain and keep that gain going at a maximal level. So, that is also something which marketers always opt for. So, this trade off is constantly on the go for marketers. You have others which follow combination of strategies at different points in time which suit those particular momentary needs. It depends on how in depth or how long term the strategy really is. Aggressive strategy necessarily does not guarantee that a win will be in the offing, but defensive strategy also necessarily does not mean that you can prevent loss. Both things have to factor in circumstances, causality, a variety of scenarios, so that we are able to manage these to the best of our abilities, and managing is at the core of understanding the animal, that is the VUCA environment as well. The irony of strategic planners is that nobody remembers how you did it, but everybody then remembers the end result. So, at the end of the day, if it worked out well in your favor, it was good strategy. So, prizes are only for winning that particular game, and so therefore, the objective that you have defined, fulfilling that objective is what is rewarded for by the people, the higher ups, the more senior brass, the stakeholders. They reward success in that particular domain. That is why no wonder you can create fabulous strategy and it can be extremely creative, and it finally just may end up being in theory. If it does not work in reality, whatever time, whatever blood and sweat, your sleepless nights that you have put into the entire activity, the amount of toil you have put in, it might all go up in vain. So, this is a very important lesson for managers. Any strategy is as good as the outcome which it is able to gain. Stakeholders will not judge you based on your strategic models and all the pro forma numbers on papers, because these are all conjecture. It is hard, cold business results that will define how well your strategy worked or not. This will be the only applause that will showcase whether your strategy truly actually went out there in the market and did its wonders. So, this chapter is designed to help you define and develop your strategic marketing plan, and hopefully it will work. So, with that in mind, let us look at strategy and marketing, how it is relevant and how we can bring it to bear on whatever we do on a day-to-day basis within the marketing function. We can link the application of strategic thought to applied areas in marketing. Why is strategic planning so important? Why is it such a dire need for marketers to always be thinking and reveling inside of that particular space? So, to start with, it is a comprehensive process. It looks at everything very, very holistically, and it helps you formulate the objectives and preferably long-term objectives. So, you may have various milestones along the way, but at the end of the day, you know what you are setting out to achieve. You may actually seed ground in the immediate offing, but with an aim to gain that larger foothold, that larger objective being resolved is what your overall aim should be. It helps you pinpoint the end of a certain strategic part of your journey. It also helps you implement whatever actions you are going to put into place strategically. And you can also look and calibrate your actions basis on the outcomes that you are getting out of whatever you have put into play. So that you ensure that because you have got to reach to a certain end point, your activities, the actions you take, the reactions you give to whatever stimuli you are facing, it helps you stay on track till you have reached that last mile. So, the scope of marketing really, it goes beyond just marketing and encompasses the entire business. I have regularly repeated this thing that we are the thinkers inside the organization. We must be able to look at various scenarios, how they affect different facets of the business's workings, its innards, its people, the way we look at talent, the way we look at resources, the way we look at conjunctions with other players outside of the organization, the way we look at markets, the way we look at consumers. All of these aspects come into play as a single symbiotic organism, and that is typically what is going to define whether we succeed or lose in our forays. So, it integrates, like we spoke of, marketing, HR, finance, production, operations and a variety of other things to achieve the unified objective which we are aiming to gain for our organization. Now, there are core components of strategic planning which we can look at here. There is at the core the guiding philosophy, which means these are certain belief systems that drive the core team as well as everybody else who is there in the organization with a singular purpose. So, that core belief is what helps them drive the organization. You try and define this by writing down a vision statement and a mission statement. The vision statement typically shows you the objective which you want to gain. What is it that will happen as an end point after all the actions are taken up, and that will be a continuing process. It is not something which stops at one particular objective milestone, but it keeps getting elongated as long as the organization is relevant in the marketplace. This defines the organization's, very importantly, purpose and what its long time aspirations are. The mission defines the path you will take, the actions you will choose to work on, and that will help you achieve whatever vision that you have devised for the organization as a whole. The objectives give you the various things to do, the to-do list if you will, and gives you specific measurable long-term goals which you then work towards achieving and marking as milestones as you move forward. There are strategic actions which you take, which is a high level game plan to achieve these particular objectives, and then implementation, which is execution of all of this formulated strategy. And whilst you are doing that, you are calibrating, you are doing a little dance and trying to figure out what can you improve so that you can get to your objectives faster, you can ensure that you do it for better, and you are probably doing it at a lesser cost. So, performance control comes in where you are monitoring and adjusting to ensure alignment with the objectives, all the while improving the process as you keep going forward. Now, why is marketing such a big requirement and why does strategic planning have such a huge role to play in it? It is a sequential necessity. Any amount of production you do, any kind of hiring and firing which the organization gets into, whatever money needs you have, these all rely on estimated sales figures. What are you going to make? What are you going to sell? How much money you are going to get out of it? All of these things define whatever else comes before it. So, the end goal defines the process, the path, the people required to achieve it, and that is why sales estimates are derived from marketing's insights and strategies. Marketing's role is to help define what can be achieved by the organization given the certain circumstances that it is operating within. Therefore, the role of marketing is, it has the front end customer interface, it tries and understands, gels and probably walks a mile or two in the shoes of the customer, so that the customer's imprinted mind space is something that is present with the organization at all times. It interprets what the market demands are and who else is there in the fray. So, you always got an eye out for competitive trends, and it also provides critical inputs for aligning other departmental plans. If you need certain innovation, your research and development department takes that particular brunt. If there is money required for that, finance takes the brunt. If there are certain personnel of a certain caliber required, HR takes the brunt. Each of these departments works alongside to ensure a final objective being met for the organization at large. So, all of these aspects come and play like cogs in a larger wheel. So, marketing has therefore got a lot of influence on strategic planning. What is its key contribution? It helps in sales forecasting and gleaning marketing insights, which inform how one must plan their business process going further. And marketing tails behind sales figures guiding cross functional alignment, like we have discussed in the previous example. It puts out all these factors across departments and looks at generating synergy across all these departments to ensure that the end objective is never something you lose sight of, and everybody is part of the entire team. All horses are pulling the carriage in one singular direction. Also, it defines the interdependence between all these functions, between all these factors, between all these departments, if you will, on the organization, the people who are manning each department. Why so? Because marketing strategy forms the foundation of the strategic business plan. Your direction, the items that you want to keep, the strategic points which you probably won't delve into for the current, because you have certain prioritization over others. And other departments which work alongside, like HR, production, finance, they also align to support marketing driven goals. Why is this important? Because if you are able to calibrate the demand and ensure you have apt amount of supply at the right price with the right distribution in place, you can ensure that the numbers which you want to achieve in your entire sales forecast, you get closer to them, at times achieving them fully or even exceeding them if you have done your job right. So, with all of these things in mind, you have to think about how marketing becomes a core function and strategic planning becomes one of the key factors that ensures you succeed in your entire marketing enterprise. Strategic marketing is linked to also business strategy at the overarching level. Why this integration is important is because marketing, the thinking part of the organization, the part which has its fingers in every single tab, in every single action, in every single consequence of said action, it serves as the bridge between strategic business planning and operational execution, which means it wants to see the entire journey mapped from a bird's eye point of view. What particular steps are required in these particular journey led milestones, and who are the people who are going to execute it, what resources do they need, what kind of monies are involved, what kind of investment is required, and what kind of time will be required. All of these factors are things that marketing has to factor in its overall game plan, so that when actual operations come about and you're executing whatever plans you've come up with, at that point in time you know exactly which particular path to walk, so that you are not left by the wayside. You are able to map your progress, you are able to chart your journey from this particular point to where you need to be. Now, in terms of focus areas, what will you need to look at when you are in marketing and planning strategically? You will look at consumer trends. How are they changing their habits, behaviors? What are the insights you can derive from that? What needs are your consumers projecting today, which may become wants and desires tomorrow as the situation also grows closer to that? Who else is participating in that particular race? Who are your competitions? What are their products? What are the benefits that they are deriving that you need to fight against? What kind of success will define that you are there in the market for long and winning? So, all of these aspects are things that you need to define while you are coming up with your strategic marketing plan. And yes, with an eye on the outcome for sure, because end of the day, all these cohesive efforts across all the various departments which we have talked about, the HR, the finance, the production, the research and development, the sales and distribution, all of these departments come together and they put in their efforts and they become cohesive through the entire role play that marketing puts them into. And this helps together achieve the shared organizational goals which you are so zealously after. So, all of these things get defined and are aimed at achieving that particular outcome. And when you keep achieving this continually, like we have discussed, your mission is attained. When your mission is attained, you have actually ended up realizing the vision of what you set out to do. So, that is the entire story of how strategic marketing is a core function of business strategy and planning. So, how do you transition whatever you have thought of to a strategic marketing plan? You create something which is for the next level. You rise beyond what you are today. You want to take whatever you have achieved so far as a benchmark and build above. It is like having a foundation and then building the edifice ever upward and onward. So, you dive into creating a functional and actionable strategic marketing plan, which means you need to know where you want to be, by how much you want to be, what all is required by it, and how are you going to break that larger task down into smaller segmented action points. Who is going to be responsible for each of those aspects, and how are you going to measure the amount of success achieved at each particular stage. So, by doing these key components and addressing them properly, you will do a lot of functions. You will get into market analysis. You will try and understand who else your competition is, what are the various VUCA alignment market forces that are working on the scenario, how do you segment your audience into proper sub segments, and how do you target them, and therefore, how do you position yourself. Now, positioning obviously will require you to create a space in their minds. So, you will also have to have the attention that you want. We have talked about the IDA model. So, awareness, intent, desire, action. So, that is the entire formula which works in this particular scenario. And you align your marketing activities with this particular strategy and your overarching business goals, so that you ensure your relevance and long term success for the entire organization. So, now we jump into a case study which showcases not just an organization, but this time a complete industry in nearby Bangladesh, which in 2010s was seeking a marketing revamp. And let's look at the realities of that particular market and how it helped shape the world from where they were to where they needed to be at that point in time. So, Bangladesh had a fledgling IT industry which was growing because education was happening and people were trying to move from menial factory led jobs to more white collared jobs. So, the aspiration was to look at next door India and come up with a particular understanding of how they could replicate the success which India had generated for itself during the Y2K conundrum. India had benefited majorly from that particular gap in the software market, and India's software thereafter had started creating a space for itself in the global scenario. So, Bangladesh's IT industry in the 2010s started to come on its own, and late in the 2010s landscape, you had nearly about 100 software houses which were producing enough and more software which were catering to a lot of requirements. They have 35 data entry centers by that time, and they had thousands of training centers and numerous computer shops. So, accessibility to data, to computers, to computing power was not something which was alien to Bangladesh at that point in time. They had a pretty alright learned urban audience which was upwardly mobile and intent on gaining that kind of corner or market share of the services job market, especially in the ITES space. Their annual revenue exceeded $350 million. So, this was the kind of environment which was the creator of Bangladesh's IT industry. They had a group called Basis which had members of about 320 plus firms, and they contributed about 100 million US dollars domestically as well as internationally. So, they were catering to both firms within the geography of Bangladesh as well as to others in South Asia, Middle East and various other geographical locations. They were seeing certain growth trends. The sites industry had, so basically the site SITS. So, it had grown by about 40% in 5 years, because obviously if the demand was there and they were able to supply, the overall market was growing, which is why in 5 years they could actually have garnered about 40% growth. But it still lagged behind forecasts, and key drivers in this case were domestic automation projects in telecom, banking, finance, pharmaceuticals and textiles, which were driving the requirement for software within the geography of Bangladesh at that point in time. So, in terms of the strength which they could bring to this particular scenario, the first and foremost thing was labor. So, which means human resources, because Bangladesh, again being a fairly densely populated country, they had a surplus of labor. Now, with education, they were coming up to a certain scale and certain level of competency, and this is where they wanted to meet the challenges head on. They currently had insufficient quantity and quality of IT graduates, which was the first thing that they wanted to put a stop to. They wanted the kind of education that was required, and they wanted that kind of workforce commitment also, to ensure that people were not only capable, but they were also committed to delivering on the goods. They were trying to reduce training costs and get better efficiency and productivity going, because they were competing with established players like India. So, these were aspects which they wanted to quickly leapfrog over. Their strengths in this particular space was they had a young workforce which was getting more and more educated. They also were intelligent enough to be trainable, and it was definitely young. So, they had a lot of work years ahead of them. So, training them today would make them productive for a fair amount of time, which would give the opportunity to earn revenue from that particular training over a longer period in time. Again, because they were a growing economy and they were behind in terms of capabilities when it came to other local players in Asia, they had competitive wages. Their lower salaries of 75 to 1200 US dollars a month was enough to attract global clients, because cheaper alternatives to what were within the Asian other players. So, they were able to garner some of that market share because of the price differential, and they wanted to ensure and run that long term employee commitment was something which was to their strength, and they would work it out, so that clients had that commitment going towards their projects in the longer run. Now, in order to be able to achieve all these things, they needed first and foremost decent infra. So, infrastructure wise, they wanted high speed, reliable data communication. In fact, in 2013, they actually 2012 to 2013 is when they actually started making the shift towards high speed data. So, Grameen phone, which is basically Telenor, was one of the first mobile phone providers to launch 3G services in Bangladesh. They were the pioneers in that particular space. They were quickly followed by Banglalink and Airtel. Airtel had by then started creating a presence inside of Bangladesh, and their national carrier as well, BTC. So, all these players were getting into the space of launching 3G, and obviously Grameen phone was the forerunner in this. They had the money, they had the backing, they had already got the infra in place. So, they launched 3G first and created a market first advantage for themselves. This was again supposed to be supported by uninterrupted power supply, for which they took power from India, and they ensured that their power supply matrix was getting better by the day. and they also tried to create accessible public IT centers for underserved populations. This was something which worked twofold, because one, it provided exposure, making it the new normal, and the second thing was it sparked entrepreneurial enterprise. Because of which ancillary businesses would get developed, because the availability of power as well as data, and you could build layers on top of it, was slowly and surely becoming more and more available to Bangladesh. What they tried to do was they tried to create a market positioning by creating opportunity to capture lower market niches which were vacated by India, because India at that point in time on their service life cycle were moving to higher end services which were value driven, which meant that they were becoming pricier, automatically vacating some of the spaces which would have to be filled up by providers who could come in for cheaper, and that is typically where they started getting the foot in the door. Strategic geographical location to access Asian markets was also something that came in a big way to help Bangladesh along. Now, beyond this, there were certain successes which they found and certain challenges which they faced. So, let us look at those. The key drivers for success of IT firms in Bangladesh was that they had management which was in some ways experienced and had foundational industry knowledge. This was the reason because they had exposure from South Asia, and Middle East and North Africa. So, because of these two locations, they had a lot of exposure. Even if they were at the mid tier level, they had the opportunity to go out, work and gain experience. They also found some experience in Europe, especially the UK, and this is typically why they were using all those experiences to their benefit, and they had certain skilled networking teams which were working, especially on the telecom VAS scenario, and they had cost effective support services because labor was cheap. Again, government at that point in time realized that this was one particular space which alongside their mainstay, which was garments, could find a lot of growth potential. So, hence tax holidays were given, import duty waivers were given, a lot of support was given to the IT industry as such to push itself into coming of its own. Again, the challenges which they faced were various. So, there were operational issues, there was lack of total IT solutions, and there was no real targeted product marketing which was happening at that point in time. Branding was definitely very weak. So, the largest brands at that point in time which were known pan Bangladesh were typically telcos. Telcos at that point in time enjoyed the maximum brand visibility and recall when it came to pan Bangladesh visibility, telcos and banks. These were the two kinds of institutions which received the maximum amount of top of mind awareness and recall in the audience across the length and breadth of the country. They also at that time were grappling with inadequate training facilities. So, they needed people coming in from overseas and helping them with that particular training aspects. A lot of Indians had gone at that point in time and trained them with everything from fundamentals to advanced stuff. Now, the access to data and the access to international published content was something which was growing. YouTube was coming up in a big way at that point in time, and it also started to become one way through which usable implementable knowledge was instantly grasped. So, this was one way which a lot of IT and IT based services started to grow and learn quickly on the trot. There was obviously high competition leading to reduced sales volumes, and this is not just within the country, it also came from Southeast Asia, where you had other growing economies which were giving a tough spot to Bangladesh. Also, in terms of client concerns, there were high prices received to the perceived value, which was not allowing many clients to come to their doorstep, and the more the dependence in this case was on word of mouth over actual branding. So, referential value was higher than actual paid for or owned or earned branding. So, which is why client acquisition was slow and a long term process, very arduous. So, that was something they were also grappling with at that point in time. Now, when we look at all these aspects, how do we make sense of the entire scenario? You have to put things in tidy little buckets, so that you understand exactly what are the factors that affect the organization or the individual or the country or the industry, whichever case you might want to apply it to. This format actually helps put any entity at the center and very analytically, logically evaluate it for whatever its capabilities are and whatever scenarios it is going to face. So, in terms of strengths for Bangladesh's IT industry, it had high profit margins, it had experienced management and a skilled workforce which was ready to implement whatever would come their way. They also had the ability to deliver customized solutions and good support services because they had cheap, quickly trainable labor. However, the weaknesses that they were facing was low sales volume because poor branding and inadequate graduate training. So, training was not something, although they had people who were trainable, the amount of training actually being imparted was on the lower side of things, and their focus was more on product attributes rather than client benefits, because they were trying to do any product life cycle, the first initial phase where they mass produce. So, which is basically a one size fits all commodity styled product inventory. The value game, as you would have seen in the previous case study when we did with Flipkart's example, that Myntra had started getting into the value game. They were talking about the perceived value from the consumer side when it came to high end experiences. So, that is really bespoke stuff, that is stuff which draws a certain kind of consumer into your fold, and it gives them the trust that the money they pay you is actually going to give them certain value in the return process. So, therefore, that is something which had not yet been evolved or was not coming out from Bangladesh's side. In terms of opportunities, they had a lot of opportunities. They could increase by doing more knowledge sharing, strategic alliances and in-house software development, not incurring too high costs. There was increased R&D also which was happening, and they wanted to innovate more and become globally competitive. But the threats were that there was less private investment and uninterrupted power. So, this was something which was putting them slightly on the back burner. Also, ineffective training facilities and the severe amount of industry competition both within and without were affecting the kind of margins that could have been derived out of it. So, why is this linkage between strategy and application very important? We see here, because marketing and innovation are two peas in a pod. When consumers want something new or something their way or something better, they are constantly demanding innovation, which means that marketing has to think through this process, and it has to also drive adoption and awareness, which means when you innovate, you create a reason for people to buy, RTB, reason to buy, and that reason to buy helps drive product or service adoption, and also at the same point in time drives awareness of it, that hey, this is a validation for why you should be purchasing me. Again, societal marketing application was one big aspect, where applicable across all social and economic conditions, it was due to focus on human welfare Interestingly, when it comes to things like software at that point in time, Bangladesh had a very successful model called bKash. bKash is basically bank cash but done electronically. They were the pioneers in this particular format, and this entire thing ran by SMS format. So, you could actually, if you had an account number linked to your mobile phone number, you could transfer money to somebody else using a formatted SMS. It was that simple. This was the precursor of the QR code based UPI system we see in India today. UPI is a far more sophisticated and advanced system, but for bare basic fundamental money transfers from one to the other, bKash was sufficient as a format for Bangladesh, and it also was very inclusive. At that point in time, remember that feature phones were still the norm. Smartphones were few and far between. So, only rare audiences actually held smartphones. Most people still used the button press variety feature phone, through which sending an SMS was the easier thing to do. They really did not have cameras to scan QR codes and such like, which is more commonplace today. Also, data was slightly costlier and less available, especially for the lower income strata of Bangladesh. Now, here future prospects grew up, positive growth trajectory was seen because it was supported by competitive workforce and strategic planning, and they did that necessary SWOT comparison with India because they had to look at some sort of benchmark. So, in terms of ITES, India was already a phenomenon worldwide. So, that is why they looked at India and tried to create sustainable global strategies mirroring what India did in its earlier days to gain some sort of a success laddering. They also clearly defined their focus areas. So, here they enhanced the infrastructure, they got global strategic partnerships going, and through that they started getting the necessary inflow of work, and from that work certain amount of payments which would come their way. They shifted from being that product centric one size fits all approach to a more listening, marketing based, client centric approach, which helped them create better products for cheaper and yet something which met client aspirations and requirements. They also got better at doing branding strategies and create international recognition, through which, especially in the ITES space, they had by that time created some amount of visibility and recognition. Now, here what they did was they actually put out a clarion call amongst the entire industry people. So, there was collaboration between government, industry leaders, educational institutes to develop talent, infra, and push the ticket towards global market penetration. All these things started to come together at the same point in time, driving the destiny of the industry upwards. Now, what the implications of this are in marketing is something we also need to understand. We have seen the cause, now we need to understand what effect it generates when it comes to the real ground. So, we need to understand how to go about it, which is where the SWOT or TOWS matrix, that particular format is something which comes very, very heavily to our rescue. This analysis is something we will look into in greater depth and detail. Now, SWOT typically, the way it is mostly known worldwide, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Now, the purpose of this entire model is all about figuring out what your business is good at. So, the strengths and the opportunities parts, they give you what you are good at, and so therefore, where you can apply it, which is what gives you the opportunity. And where it can't improve, it is a weakness, and that weakness can actually become a threat going further. So, it can get in the way of its progress and its destiny. So, the knots and the ticks are what help define which particular path to take, what particular corrective measures to implement, so that you are able to ride out the storm. Now, when we look at elements of SWOT analysis, first and foremost we look at strengths. Let us work with this example. So, internal capabilities typically, which are your strengths, can help in achieving objectives which you have again defined. This is probably one of the biggest strengths you can have. Then for example, technological superiority, skilled workforce, strong brand reputation, these are all strengths. These are all things you have already got in your kitty. You have achieved them through your efforts, and now you can leverage these to achieve certain objectives you have in mind. The other thing is then weaknesses. So, what are weaknesses? They are internal limitations that actually do not allow you to perform that well. And so, therefore, examples are inadequate distribution network, if you have lack of innovation or high churn in the employees. So, people keep coming and going out of your organization very quickly. Then opportunities, where you have external factors and the organization can exploit these to its advantage. Whereas, so example wise, in emerging markets you can actually get in faster and sooner to establish a first mover advantage. In terms of technological advancements, what you can do is create disruptions in the market, and changes in consumer preferences again helps you become a first mover if you capitalize on them. Whereas threats are external factors which could cause trouble for the organization. For example, the rise of new competitors, regulatory changes from the government side, again economic downturns, both these things are VUCA in their nature. So, you understand where implications from VUCA scenarios play out in the entire path to success. Now, if you flip this on its head, you get the TOWS analysis or TOWS analysis, whichever way you want to pronounce it. Now, TOWS is threats, opportunities, weaknesses and strengths, not very different from SWOT. The only item worth noting here is TOWS prefers to prioritize the external behavior, the external environment first, and then looks at inward looking stuff which is internal, and devise a strategy that align the external opportunities with internal strengths. Both analyses result in a matrix that aids in strategic planning. So, that is a given. This is an example of how the matrix will get structured. So, if you have got internal sources or you have got external sources, and whether you can see if they are helpful in achieving your objectives or harmful to you. So, you get the mapping of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. This matrix helps visualize how strengths and opportunities align. So, you will see both are helpful in achieving objective. So, whether it be internal or external, they align together, and the opposite is true for weaknesses and threats, and therefore, you need to address them accordingly. What can be examples of SWOT elements? Strengths may be high quality products, you can have tech superiority, you can have skilled workforce, all of these things are strengths. Weaknesses could be poor distribution, lack of delivery vehicles, safety issues in the factory, some report of accidents, a variety of things. Opportunities could be competitors' quality issues, some delays happening at their end, etc. Distribution delays happening from their side, if somebody goes on a strike in their factory, or consumers themselves shift their consumer tastes better towards your alignment. So, all these things could be opportunities, whereas threats could be things like higher government duties which are regulatory in nature, competitor innovations which they are using to disrupt the market, and in terms of competitor capacity growth where they can outshout you or outsell you. So, all of these things are part of what can stand for SWOT elements, divided into each of these 4 buckets. So, the importance of SWOT now starts to come into play. We have discussed the entire process of doing marketing strategy and how it plays a larger role in the entire organizational success. In our case, we will see objective setting is something which works in your favor when you know your strengths and weaknesses and you can set achievable goals. Now, when you are setting goals, how do you go about that entire task and set up goals that are truly helpful for you as a tactical journey as well as align with your strategic objectives. You put them up as SMART objectives. SMART is an acronym for specific, which means you have to put in stuff that is clear and precise, defined in that way, measurable so that you understand what the criteria for success are and how you will actually keep a tab on whether you have done the things right or not. Then achievable, they have to be realistic with whatever resources you are blessed with. They have to be realistic, which means they have to be practical and within reach. And finally, you have to set a timeline, time bound, so that you know by this particular cutoff date, you need to know how well you have actually been able to work towards achieving that objective that you set out to in the first place. So, with all these factors, what you come to know is that you will have to take something which is completely ill defined or something which is completely loose there or something which is very, very global in nature, and then turn it into a SMART objective, so that it helps you drive and it helps you galvanize action from the entire organization side towards achieving that particular objective. So, let us say we start with a non-specific objective. Top brass says, okay, next year let us increase profits. How do you classify this back or reword this back into a SMART objective? So, all departments should cut operational costs without sacrificing quality to boost profits by 2% within a year, enabling competitive pricing for customers. So, we have gone into specific. So, this is very, very specific in its nature. The second is measurable. So, the moment you start putting in numbers, you are making it measurable. Then again a year is again a measure of time. Then you have got achievable. So, it is not too high, you have set 2%, which is a fairly easily achievable target, and that too within an entire year. So, these are examples of how you make it achievable, so that you do not lose morale while on the journey. Then next is realistic, and because you have to work with whatever resources you are blessed with. So, you have to ensure that within those resources these things are objectives which you can land upon, and finally T, which is time bound. So, this thing of a year is typically time bound, which is what we are talking about. So, these are ways you can take a very, very loosely worded brief and convert it into a very, very specific SMART objective, and this is something which marketers and all management personnel should learn and implement in their day to day. Once you have done SMART objectives, what else can be done? Because you can move into further models. I will introduce one, we will cover it sometime going further. It is called Porter's value chain analysis. Why is it called a value chain analysis? Because if there are a certain number of players or actors in the production of something that brings value to, say, the customer at the end. So, each of these particular nodes is doing something with the input that comes from the previous node and improving it while it finally reaches the consumer. So, at each particular point there is a little bit of value that is added to each of these nodes. So, when you reach the final customer point, you are creating a value at the end of the day, and this entire series together is called the value chain. So, hence with that particular pretext in mind, you understand what a value chain is. Obviously, Porter was the person, Michael Porter was the person who came up with this, and in definition it is a tool to understand how value is added to products or services throughout the business's activities. These all may be different activities for that particular product to reach the customer. What is its purpose? It identifies improvement areas and gives you a competitive edge, so that it keeps in mind who else is doing what. Then components wise, it has primary activities which are inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, and service. And in terms of support activities, you have got things like infra, HR, tech and procurement, which help build the entire push towards getting that particular activity out there in the open and ensure that it reaches its aim as an objective and is realized. So, with all that in mind, we sum up SWOT and showcase that it is emphasizing the importance of knowing your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats through the SWOT or TOWs, whichever you want to prioritize, and then you apply it on the value chain analysis format going further. And what needs to happen next is you need to encourage the use of certain tools like this for strategic planning within the organization and setting realistic goals. Why should you set realistic goals? So that it provides the right motivation with clarity to personnel. So, this is critically important. So, the motivation will push people instead of giving them added stress. Stress is not happening. So, that way people are more productive. So, in all, understanding what your business has to offer when it comes to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats through the SWOT or TOWs analysis gives you a detailed value chain analysis, and this is essential for strategic planning. These tools provide a comprehensive view of both what you have internally and what is happening around you, and they help set up a realistic and achievable objective, thereby giving the right amount of motivation to the personnel in your organization. When you leverage your strengths, address your weaknesses, seize the opportunities that are there and guard or mitigate against threats, as business you can create a clear roadmap to success, which we call as clear path to success, which you may see as CPTS in the corporate space. This approach ensures that your goals are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound, which is summed up in SMART, and this enhances your ability to compete and thrive in the market. Embracing these analyses fosters informed decision making, because you are already trained and aligned to pick up points and ensure you deliver in this particular direction. It also paves the way for sustainable growth and competitive advantage. Implementing all these can significantly improve your strategic planning process, and more on this in the following modules we will take up, so that you get a holistic understanding of starting to think in marketing and strategic terms. So, we will move on to more such concepts, models and preferably case studies going further. That is all for this conversation. Thank you for being a lovely audience. I will see you next time.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. We usually know William Shakespeare as the most revered figure in the history of English literature. But we often tend to forget that he has also been one of the most hated figures in literature. And here I am not talking only about those boys and girls who have to memorize long sections from Macbeth or King Lear or Julius Caesar before they can go and sit for their school or college exams. But I am also talking about people who are themselves quite famous authors. Tolstoy, for instance, considered the writings of Shakespeare to be, and I quote, crude, immoral, vulgar, and senseless. George Bernard Shaw absolutely loathed Shakespeare, as he did Homer. But perhaps no other criticism about Shakespeare is more damaging than the one which says that Shakespeare is a marvelous storyteller, provided someone has told him the story earlier. Now, this piece of criticism is particularly damaging because it is true. None of Shakespeare's plays contain any original story whatsoever. They are all written using pre-existing materials, pre-existing stories. Now, does that diminish the stature of Shakespeare as a dramatist? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippets.